I'm going to talk a little bit more about selecting bees and breeding bees and what we've been doing for the last few years. And I went off and did some other things when I was a younger man after college, and then decided that, beekeeping's not a bad way to make a living. It's a wonderful way of life in many respects. So I came back and rejoined my father in the business in 1989, and we subsequently divided up weaver apiaries, and Dad and I formed bee weaver apiaries. I picked a great time to come back into beekeeping because we picked up Varroa mites in North Dakota in 1989, the year I came back. And the year after that, Africanized bees crossed the Rio Grande into Texas. So I've been living with those two nemesis for the past, 20 years now, 21 years. So it was a great way to get back into beekeeping because those represented two distinct but very serious challenges that we've been confronting ever since. I think we have managed to cope with Africanization real well. I was, like my father in Venezuela, scared to death when I first saw what was happening in South Texas because we kept some bees out toward Del Rio, south of San Antonio, in the brush country out there. And when I first encountered them in the brush country, they were relatively purely first-generation F1 hybrids, and they would sting the pants off of you. And it was quite a battle for the first couple of years out in that part of the world, where we'd have to go in, and if we left yards out in that brush country, we'd have to go in and requeen the colonies, often more than once a year, in order to suppress the Africanization that was fairly rampant. But by requeening, we were able to manage Africanization. So again, I want to reemphasize what my father said a moment ago. That is the right way to deal with the problem, and we've been able to successfully manage it that way. We do have some degree of Apis mellifera scutellata, the African bee, in our own stock, and we've determined that by genotyping bees and looking for markers that originally came from various populations. In fact, our bees are quite hybridized. They contain signals from all four of the major subspecies: Apis mellifera mellifera, the German black bee or dark bee of Western Europe; Apis mellifera ligustica, or the Italian bee from Southern Europe; Apis mellifera caucasica from the Caucasus region in the Near East; and Apis mellifera scutellata from Africa. The scutellata signal is the smallest in our bees right now, and we hope to keep it that way. But there are some important advantages that Africanized bees can offer. And I want to suggest to you that we ought to keep our mind open and not just assume that because there is some African component in the genome of bees here in Texas that that's necessarily a bad thing. As long as they're not mean, as long as they're not stinging you, as long as they're not causing problems, it might be a good thing because they might have some benefits, particularly resistance to some of the diseases that we're confronting, some of the parasites that we're confronting. So I'm going to show you a little PowerPoint here as I continue to talk and focus more directly on the second challenge that I faced when I came back into beekeeping, which we all continue to face today: Varroa mites. And that's how that's what we've focused on. That's what we've made our principal priority now for a long time. So my dad and I decided when we started Bee Weaver that we were going to make that our primary objective because we didn't like putting chemicals in beehives to control parasites. We felt like that was a bad idea. Fairly early on, we got the impression that acaricides, the chemicals that we can use to control mites, had a deleterious effect on the hive, particularly on queens, on queen fecundity and longevity. And we embarked on a research project in conjunction with Tim Harmon at Los Alamos National Laboratory and Marla Spivak at the University of Minnesota. And we determined that, yes, in fact, even using the registered chemicals at the recommended dosages, precisely according to the label, you could detect very serious and alarming negative effects on queens. And so that gave some further urgency to our efforts, we felt like. And so we decided to undertake a program selecting for Varroa resistance. Now, a lot of what we've always done, breeding bees the old-fashioned way, we applied to this project too. It's all about phenotypic selection. the phenotype of the hive, the characteristics of the hive. That's what counts. So what are we going to look at? We're going to look at hives that can survive Varroa infestation. Well, how do you go about that? What's the right way to do it? Do you choose some surrogate marker of resistance? Do you look for bees that suppress mite reproduction? Do you look for bees that have a shorter development time? Do you look for bees that exhibit grooming behavior and chew the mites off your bees? How do you do that? That's the first thing you've got to think about. We decided the most robust way to do it was to simply look for bees that survived Varroa infestation. And, and did it without a lot of intervention, without a lot of management techniques, without a lot of chemical acaricide treatments. So that was our strategy, but there are other ways to do it. And some of the other programs sponsored by USDA have instead focused on these other traits that are believed to associate with Varroa resistance. The problem is you can fool yourself, okay? And let me give you an example. So there's been a lot of talk, and if you read the bee journals, hygienic behavior has been something that everybody talks about and has talked about for the last 10 years since Marla Spivak repopularized that idea. She didn't invent that nomenclature, and she wasn't the first person to care about selecting bees for hygienic behavior, but she brought that back into fashion. But just selecting for bees that remove dead brood doesn't necessarily get you to bees that are resistant to Varroa mites, because general hygiene is different from Varroa-specific hygiene. That is, bees that will actually get rid of the brood that's infested by Varroa. That's a slightly different trait than bees that will just remove dead brood. So you got to be careful. If you're going to look for intermediate surrogate markers of resistance, you got to make sure you focus on one that really counts, and you got to measure it correctly too, because you can trick yourself if you don't measure your Varroa mite populations at the right time of the year, for instance. If you decide to pick colonies that don't have big Varroa mite populations and breed from those, well, you got to know when you're going to measure that, and how much brood's in your colony when you're measuring that, and how many bees are in your colony. Have you just requeened the colony? Has the colony gone through a dearth period where it's not rearing brood so that there are more mites out on the adult bees? Or on the other hand, is it early springtime where they've got 7 combs of brood and all the mites are in the brood nest? If you do a sugar dusting or an ether roll at that time of year, you can think, oh, this hive doesn't have any mites, when in fact it's loaded with mites. You just got to wait for a couple more brood cycles, and suddenly you've got mites everywhere. So if you're going to do this sort of thing for yourself, you got to be careful about how you do it and how you measure it. But we decided to just focus on what is most important from our perspective: bees that survive Varroa infestation without chemical treatment. And I should back up to say that when I shared my ideas about how we were going to try to do it with Tom Renderer, who's the research leader of the Baton Rouge Bee Lab, he said, well, just remember what Dr. Rutner said about Varroa mites when they first got to Europe. He's always said that it's going to be impossible to select for bees that are resistant to Varroa mites. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, Dr. Rutner said, we still haven't found sheep that are resistant to wolves. And finding bees that are resistant to Varroa mites is just about the same deal. And the other question to ask yourself, and Dad and I have pondered this many times, is will you still be in business by the time you get there? Okay? Because we lost thousands of colonies in this effort over the course of the past 15 years. We lost most of those in the early years. Anyway, it's all about using evolution to sort out the winners and the losers, natural selection, and looking for bees that have adapted to Varroa. And, it's a real challenge for queen breeders to do this, because queen breeders need to think about 2 things. They need to think about breeder queens and raising good cells and controlling the mother's genetics, but you also got to worry about the drones. You got to have lots of drones to rear queens. Well, what are you raising when you're raising drones? Varroa mites, because they preferentially reproduce in drone brood. Okay? So it's a 2-edged sword for queen breeders. You got to have lots of drones, but if you're breeding drones, you're going to be breeding Varroa mites right along with them. So that makes it particularly important to focus on bees that are truly resistant, and but it gives you the added advantage. If you're raising bees that are varroa resistant, and you have them in the queen yard and you're producing lots and lots of drones, that's a good test to see whether you're getting anywhere. Because if you got lots of drones in your hive and you don't have many varroa mites, you got something. It all began, like I said earlier, in 1989 when